Okay, then. So we're here on Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis, and we're studying the drasha of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that once the Adon, in the case of an Omevriya, was Peras Talisa Oleh, in other words, for the purpose of Yud, he was Miyayid her, then Shuv Ein Rashoy L'Mochra. Rabbi Akiva holds he cannot sell her if she becomes an almana or a grusha, because he interprets the word bebigdo in the pasuk bebigdo ba, after which it says liam nochri lo yimshol lemochra, meaning that the father has no rishus to sell it. That's after bebigdo ba, which means after kiddusha yid. So the father no longer has rights to sell his daughter, who's still a ketana, as an omevriya after he was mekadosh her with kiddusha yid. And we can understand from Rabbi Akiva that if he wasn't miyayid her, then she would go back to the rishus of the father, and he could sell her as a shivcha. So, in other words, Rabbi Akiva fundamentally accepts the possibility of a father selling his daughter of Ketana as an Amavriya twice. However, that's not going to be the case if in between the first and the second he was miyayid her. And that's called bevigdo. But Rabbi Eliezer disagrees, and he says bevigdo ba, and he's not going to read the pasuk as if it says beged, but rather as if it says bagad. Kevan she bagad ba. Now, what is bagad ba? Literally translated as he was a traitor to her. What it means in this context is that if the father sells her as an omevriya, like as a shivcha, he's not treating her as a father would normally treat his daughter, and that's called bagad ba. And shuvein rashoy lemochra, he can no longer sell her again. So that means that according to Rabbi Eliezer, once he sells her as an amma, the father sells his daughter as an amma, he can never again sell her a second time around. So even if after, let's say, Sheish Shanim or Yovel, she returns back to the rishus of her father for all dinim, but nevertheless, he cannot sell her a second time around as an omevriya. And that's the way Rabbi Eliezer understands the words bebigdo ba and then liam nochri lo yimshol lemochra. That bebigdo ba means that he already sold her as a shivcha, as an omevriya once. But however, if let's say he was mekadosh her without selling, like the father could accept Kiddushin for his daughter, he never sold her as an omevriya, and then she became an almana or a grusha, and she goes back to the rishus of her father as a ketana, then he could sell her as an omevriya. So whereas Rabbi Akiva, we medayik that if he wasn't miyayid her, then she goes back to the rishus of the father, and he could sell her a second time as a shivcha. According to Rabbi Eliezer, once he sold her the first time as a shivcha, he was boged ba, and he could no longer sell her as a shivcha. So that Rabbi Akiva holds that even after shivchus, meaning he was mocher her, he could sell her a second time if 6 years pass by or after the Yovel. Whereas Rabbi Eliezer says no, there's no circumstance in which he could sell her twice as an omevriya. And the Gemara is saying now, beplukta tahani tanoi. Those were the last words on Yud Ches Amud Aleph, meaning the machlokas Tanakam and Rav Shimon, which we had here on the bottom of Yud Ches Amud Aleph, revolves around the machlokas between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Eliezer, meaning that the drasha of Rabbi Akiva fits well to the sheet of the Tanakama, who says that once there was an ishus, the father now no longer could sell her as an amma. And that is derived, I should say, from bebigdo ba, which is read as beged, which means that he married her off, which is called paras talisa oleha. He can sell her as a shivcha after shivchus, but not after ishus. And the dissenting view of the Tanakhama, that of Reb Shimon, he reflects the drasha of Rabbi Eliezer. and therefore he holds that the pasuk says you can't sell her as a shivcha once you sold her as a shivcha. The Maika Miflagi. How did this machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva evolve? Whereas Rabbi Eliezer reads it as big dopa, that he sold her and he was boged ba, sold her as an amma, and Rabbi Akiva says no, but big dopa means he gave it to Ishis and Peres Talisa Olem. Gemara says Rabbi Eliezer Sava Yeshem Lemesores, Rabbi Akiva Sava Yeshem Lemikra. So we have a machlokas which appears all over Shas about whether we go by the Mesores and the drasha should be based on the Ksiv, the way it's written in the Torah, or Yesh Aim LeMikra means Mikra Miloshen Kriya, the way we read it. So Rabbi Eliezer holds Yesh Aim LeMesores, and everything depends upon the way it's written. And if you look at the letters of the word Bibigdo, you could put a kamat under the second base, and then it becomes Bibugdo, which is a lashon of Begida, which means that he sold his daughter as an amma, and therefore Einu Yachol Li'am Nochri Lo Yimshal Ba L'Mocher. Now, the basic writing of the Torah that allows you to put a kamatz under the second base, Bibugdo, is without a yud. And since there's no yud, you could read it as Bibugdo. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, holds Yeshem LeMikra. Everything depends upon how it's read. And we don't read it as Bibugdo, but rather we have a tradition as reading it as Bibigdo, which refers to a beged. And we saw this already in the parish of Yosef and Eshes Potifar. It says, Vatitpaseu Bibigdo. So we read it with a chirik under the second base, not a kamatz, and Bigdo refers to Kiddushin Yid. Now, based on this, the Gemara wants to explain Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon's shita is that on the one hand, he accepts the drasha of Rabbi Akiva, that Bibigdo means beged, and it's prisas, taliso, and kiddushin, but he also at the same time accepts the reading and the drasha of Rabbi Eliezer, namely that it means begida, and we're talking about selling her as an omevriya. So that's what the Gemara says now. Rabbi Shimon Sava Yeshem LeMikra VeLaMesoros. Notice we have a license to darshan a pasuk two different ways, deriving two different halachas from the same word, because we read it both LeMikra and LeMesoros. So therefore, we interpret the pasuk both lefi kriya and lefi ksiva. And again, if it's lefi ksiva, then we read it as Bibugdo. And if it's Lefi Kriya, then we read it as Bibigdo. So just to summarize Rabbi Shimon's shita, he holds that once the father gave her over to either Ishus, which means Bibigdo, or he gave her over to Amhus, which is Bibugdo, in both cases, he no longer can sell her as an Amavri. So whether it's Shifchus Achar Ishus or Shifchus Achar Shifchus, it's totally excluded. Boy Rabba Baravur, Yehud Nisuinose o Erisinose. This reminds me of the sugi we had earlier about Kiddushin Bia. Here too, with regard to Yehud, when the Adon says to the Amma, Hare at Yehuda li bekesef miknasech. No, it's the kesef that I gave to your father in order to purchase you as an Amma. I want to use that now for you. And that creates an Ishus relationship. She becomes an Ishus Ish. And now the question is whether she's a full-fledged Nesua or she's only a Narusa. Nafkamina, three Nafkaminas. Number one, Liarusha. If she dies, does the Arus inherit her estate? And the answer is no, because he's only an Arus. Or do we say no, Nesuinosa, and therefore he inherits his wife after she dies? L'tamila, if he's a Kohen, can he bury her? Ulahafer nidorea, can he be made for nidorea as a one-man show? And why is that? Because she is an arusa. Just 1 second. Correct. If she's an arusa, then her husband has no rights to be made for nidarim. It's totally dependent upon her father. Now, these three dinim, that the father no longer inherits his daughter, but rather the husband does. The father can't be mitamila, but rather the husband does. The father cannot, as a single effort, be made for nidarim. All these dinim apply if you assume that Yehud creates Nesuin. Because once she's a Nesua, then she leaves the Rishus of her father, even though she's still a Katan. What's the din? Toshma. Let's see if we can prove this from the following brisa. The brisa that we quoted earlier on the pasuk Li'am Nochil Yimshal L'Machra Bebigdo Ba is Kevan, this is Rabbi Akiva, Sheperes Taliso Alea Shuv Ein Rashay L'Mochra. So he can no longer sell her if she becomes a grusha or an almana. And why is that? Bebigdo Ba, because he gave her over for marriage. So the Gemara wants to be a daik from this price. Zibuni hudelo mazbinla. He cannot sell her as an amavriya for shivchus. Once he was miyayid her, and she came back into the rishus of the father after misa sabal or after gerish. It would seem that although he lost his rights lemachra, the father lost it, but he still retains his rights to be miyayid her, which means that there's ishus achar ishus. But for iyamrit nesuin osa, if you're going to tell me that the first Yehud takes her out of the rishus of the father because she's already nesua, is kemin shenisei shuva ein lavir rishus ba. It's no longer been urea based on via, even if she's a ketana after nesuin. Once the father gave her over to nesuin, he no longer has a rishus ba. So therefore, even after her husband dies or was miskasha, she doesn't go back to the rishus of her father. And the source for this is that what the Torah writes in the parsha of Hafaras Nedarim, in Parshas Matos Bamidbar Lamed, that im nisarmul on niskashim nesuin ein choser rishus ha'av, ein yochel hafaras nedorel v'chein linyan Yerusha. We darshan from a pasuk in the parsha of Yerusha, v'yarash osa, that means baila Yerusha mishenises v'lo avia. So therefore, how can he now be Makadisha to someone else if after Nesuin she left the rishus of her father? And we were medayik from the Mishnah that he could give her over, the father give over his daughter a second yud if she was niskash in this almala from the first yud. It must be that yud only creates erisin, and therefore after she became an almana gush, she goes back to the rishus of her father because she never had nesuin, and therefore he could be miyayid her a second time around, the father. Now the Gemara rejects this proof. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Hocha b'Kiddushin di Alma Koi. The Brisa is not talking about Yehud. It's talking about Keren Shepiresh Taliso Leo, means the father accepted Kiddushin on behalf of his daughter who's a Ketana. He never sold her for a Shivcha. But Hachikara, this is what the Brisa has in mind. Kevan Shemisara Avia Lemishan Eschayev B'She'era Ksusav Onosa Shuv Ena Yochel Lemochra. Once the father married off his daughter, he was Makadish's daughter, now he can no longer sell her as a shivcha. Because Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak interprets Perish Talis Olea as a kind of a phrase, a melitza, for Mesiras Ha'avis Habas Likiddushin. And therefore the Baal becomes Chayav in Ksusa, means malbushim, and in other chiyuvei ishus like mizonos and ona. So therefore, Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that once the father was moser as bitol Kiddushin, shuvein rashoy lemochra le'ama, and that's how Rabbi Akiva, as we saw earlier, derives from the pasuk li'amnochri lo yimshel ba lemochra bebigdo ba, and bebigdo ba is referring to Kiddushin, not to Yehud, but rather to regular classical Kiddushin, and he can no longer sell her as a shivcha. And that's the pasuk lo yimshal lemochra bebigdo ba. Toshma. Let's bring another raya that Kiddushin, that Yehud creates Kiddushin. Ein mochra lekrovin. The father is not allowed to sell his daughter as an amma in a situation where it would be impossible to implement Yehud, meaning he marries off his daughter to a man who is an ervata, like one of her krovin. And we're talking about an erva where ein Kiddushin tofsin, so that built into the mechira of Amavriya is the possibility that he could be miyayid. But if she's an erva, that he cannot sell her to an erva, because then there's no possibility of yud, because ein Kiddushin tofsin be erva. And this is basically what the Torah means when it says in Ra'ah beinei Adonai asher lo ye'ada, which means that he should give her over to someone, an Adon, who has the possibility of Yud. So that's the opinion of the Tanakam. Mishum Rabbi Eliezer Amru, the dissenting view of Rabbi Eliezer, Mochra lekrovim. He can sell her to Krovim. She doesn't have to be, in order for the Mechira as an Omer to be valid, have to be Re'uya Yud. But nevertheless, Vishavim, both Tanakam and Rabbi Eliezer agree unanimously, Shemochra almana l'kohen gadol or grush v'chalutz kohen edgen. If he's selling her as an Omer to someone who has Tfisas Kiddushin, because the Iser is only an Iser Lav, and Kiddushin Tovsa b'chayvei Lavim, then the Yud is valid. So it means that it's not a question of can he be Mekadosh or can he not be Mekadosh, but the question is whether the Kiddushin would be valid b'di'evet if he went ahead and he was Mekadosh, and then the Mechira is a Mechira that lends itself to Yud, and it's a din apparently in the Gavra and the Shem Erva. If there's no Gavra Shem Erva, then he can sell it to for Yud, even though he won't be able to be Miyayid, to sell it for an Amma, even though he won't be able to be Miyayid because of the Isser Lav, but nevertheless is Tfisas Kiddushin. The Gemara analyzes this price. Hi Almana Hechi Don. This din of an Almana that was mentioned in the Brisa, so what exactly is the case? Even with the Kaddish Nafsha, if we're going to tell us that the Ketana, because again, Omer Vri is always a Ketana, she sold herself without her father's approval, and then her so-called husband dies, Almana Karile, you can't call her an Almana. She was never married to begin with, so you can't call her a divorcee. I shouldn't say a divorcee, a widow, if she was never married to begin with, because the Maisa Ketana is not recognized by the Allah. Ela de Kichavia, but rather the father was Mekadesh her. Is Mimotzi Mazbinla? Can the father sell her after he gave her over to Ishus? And we're going to hold now that Ein Adam Mocher as Bito L'Shivchus Achar Ishus. Once he married her off, he can no longer, even if she becomes an Almana, sell her as an Amma Vriya. And this is Rabbi Akiva's Shita, who says that after Kiddusha Yud, there's no Mechira L'Shivchus. Now, exactly why the Gemara is taking the view of Rabbi Akiva, I guess the assumption is that we accept Rabbi Akiva. Again, we're not rejecting Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that a father could sell his daughter for a shivcha after Ishus, but right now we're holding like Rabbi Akiva. The Omer of Amram. Here we have to underline Rabbi Amram, because otherwise we might mess up the sugi. Omer Rabbi Amram, Rabbi Yitzchak, Hacha b'kedusha yid. Here we're talking about a woman who was niskadeshes b'kedusha yid, and then her husband died. V'aliba de Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda the Amar, most Rishonos lavla kedusha nitnu. When a man buys an omivri and he gives the av to Mei Miknasa, that's not going to be established on Mafreya as Kesef Kiddushin, but rather he has to be Makadishar with something else. With what is he Makadishar according to Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda? With the fact that he could be Mochel her on the Shibud. Let's say she has another 3 years of Shibud of work, and he's Mochel on the 3 years. That's considered as if he gave her now Kesef in her hand for the purpose of Kiddushin. And this is sugya later on in Daf Yutes, which we hope to get to. And Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak rejects this interpretation of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, but we're learning now of Amram. So now let's just summarize the bottom line here. Since this Kiddushin is not chal through the Av, but rather it's Xeris HaKosav, that the Kiddushin is, so to speak, spontaneously developed, generated. Therefore, the father remains holding on to his rights to sell her as an Omavriya after these Kiddushin. So that even though Rabbi Akiva says that there's no Shivchus, no Mechira after Ishus, but that's only because the father was Makadesh her. And therefore he forfeits his rights to sell her as an Amma subsequently because of the Pasuk B'Bigdo Ba. However, if the father didn't give her over for Kiddushin, but rather Kiddushin was chal spontaneously through the mechila of the Adon on the balance of the years of Shibud, then the father did not give up his koach, his rights, his authority to sell her as an Omavri. So the father only forfeits his rights to sell his daughter if he himself was Makadisha and received her Kiddushin. Okay, fine. Now, what does it prove about Yud? The Gemara is analyzing it now. V'i Amrit, if you're going to tell me Yud Nisuin Osa, then I can't understand how the father could sell her as a shivcha after Yud, because Yud is already in Nisuin and she left the rishus of the father. So even though she became an almana or grusha, she doesn't return. And again, even though she's a ketana, she does not return to the rishus of the father, because that kiddushin that the father accepted culminated in Nisuin. But now we're holding not where the father was Makadisha, but where the father sold her as an Amma, and then the Adon was Miyayid her, and it's not the father who receives the Kesef Kiddusha Yud, because that would be most Rishonos LeKiddusha Nitnu, but we're holding now like whom? Like Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, that most Rishonos Lav LeKiddusha Nitnu, and the Adon could marry this Amma with Kiddusha Yud in a spontaneous way without the father's active involvement. So now the Gemara wants to slug up this raya. Elomai, you tell me Erisinosa. Okay, fine. You still don't explain the brisa, because the brisa is holding Vishavin. Both Tanakam and Rabbi Lezer agree. Shemochra, he can sell her as an almana to a Kohen Gadol. And ha'ein adam mocher espito l'shivchus achara ishus. Even if there was only Kiddushin, he could no longer sell her as an omavriya. So how does the father retain his rights to sell his daughter as a shivcha after Yud, even if I assume, like you wanted to prove that Yud is Erisim Osa, but we're holding now that everybody agrees and it's unanimous that what? That he can sell her So we're assuming now if Yud Erison so then he can now sell her as an Omivriya second time after this Almrila and this Karsha, because it wasn't the father who actively set up the issues, but we have a problem because Ein on the Mocher is Bitol Shivchas Achar Ishus. So again, it's not the fact that the father himself gave her over and was makabel her Erison and gave it to Erison. That's not what's going to be mafkia, his ability to sell her as an Amma, but rather it's the Ishus itself. Elamai Isa Lememar, you're going to have to tell me that there's something inherently different about this Ishus. Shiny Erison Dida me Erison Davia. And there's a difference between the Erison of the Bas Atzma, which is called Yud, which is Chal Shalal Yedei Avia, because again, we're going according to Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, who says most Rishonos Lavadish. So it's different than the Erison when her father was Ma'arisa and he accepted the Kesef Erison, Kesef Kiddushin. If the father accepted the Kesef Erison, then he certainly cannot sell her as an Omivriya because we're holding Ein other Mochers Bitol Shivchas Achar Ishus. But here it's a different kind of an Ishus because it's Shalo Al Yedei Ha'av. So therefore, Afilu Temen Isuanosa. Once we're saying that this Ishus is a different quality of Ishus as far as the father's ability to, after Almonus and Gerushin, to reestablish his authority, his power over his daughter to sell her as an Amma, that I could go even a step further. I could say that even if Yud should be upgraded to the status of Nisuin, but this is not a Nisuin that takes her out of the Rishus of her father. Why? Shani Nisuin Dida, mi Nisuin Di Avia. There's a difference between Nisuin. Again, the word Dida here, as we saw earlier, means Yehud, where the father was not involved. It was the Adon's decision. And that's different than Nisuin Di Avia, when the father himself brings his daughter into the chuppah and therefore removes his rishus over the daughter. So the Gemara now rejects this argument. Hi, my. What kind of equation is this? Bishleva Erison, Erison, Shani. You could make a distinction between one category of an Erison and another category of Erison. Why? Because Erison is not mafkia her, it doesn't remove her from the rishus of the father. So then you can say, well, if the father was actively involved, then he loses his rights henceforth to sell her as an Amma. But if the father wasn't involved, but rather was Kedusha Yud, so Shaloi Yidei Maisa Av, then he could sell her. So that's called the Gemara's language. Erison is fine. El and Isuin mean Isuin. And here we move to Daf Yutes.